thank you for, my God, there are a lot of people. You must have some alternative like class or something.
Hello, everybody, and hello, Justice Breyer. So today, this is Justice Breyer, by the way. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction, and then we'll have a Q&A, and then toward the end, we will open up the floor to ask questions from the floor to Justice Breyer. So the brief introduction is that Justice Breyer is a graduate of this law school, class of 1964. He served in many jobs in the executive branch and in the Senate, in the legislative branch. He was a judge on the First Circuit, including the chief judge for 4 years, designed a really very, very nice courthouse, and then has served on the Supreme Court since 1994 until his retirement this year, and now he has returned to the Harvard Law School faculty, where he served for 13 years in the 1960s, 70s, and the beginning of the 1980s. And he's back as the Byrne Professor of Administrative Law and Process. And today we're going to hear a little bit about, we're going to hear, I'm not sure why that was a laugh line.
So, you know, there are only 10 people in the United States who really like administrative law.
Not at the Harvard Law School. So today we're going to ask a few questions. So the first question is this. So there are a lot of 1Ls in this room, right? Okay. You were once a 1L. What did you think about 1L? How did you feel about your first year in law school?
Well, I do remember. It was quite a lot of work. And I had very good teachers. I really did. I had Al Sachs was my procedure teacher, so they don't know these people, but they were fabulous. Jack Dawson, my God, he was a great contracts professor and a very nice man. And A. James Kasner, my property professor, and all we did these things. I don't know if you still do them or not, like springing uses, and it was whatever was the real Hornbook law of property in 1740, and yeah, it was interesting, and it might have helped my becoming a judge. Well, inside story, I haven't told this very, not that it's, all right. Look, I worked for Senator Kennedy for 2 or 3 years, and he calls me in one day, and Tom Winship is there. Well, Tom Winship is the editor of the Globe. We're talking about something, and he knew I knew something about it. And for some reason afterwards, there came up something about property, and for some reason, I can't tell you what, this thing about springing uses or shifting uses or whatever the heavens name it was, and the Treaty of Daydonis or something, 1250, whatever. And there I was, and he said, "Do you know anything about this?" I said, "Yeah, actually, I do know." And there we are. And I promise you, whenever I saw Kennedy after that, half the time he'd go, which meant it's a springing use or something. And I'm sure he told President Clinton, "This man really knows property." Something like that. Well, that was great. And Charles Fried, it was his first year of teaching.
Is that right?
Yeah,
wow.
And Paul Dodig, who was a great friend of mine, several of us were very good friends. We knew that was his first year of teaching. And I don't say that. It wasn't his fault. I just think the milk of human kindness was not running from our hearts. But he became a great teacher.
But that was wrong, right?
Yeah. He became a great teacher. And Al Sachs taught me. So I remember this stuff. I don't necessarily remember what they taught, but I remember the mood in the room. It was serious. It was interesting. And my father had given me advice about how to survive, so I'll pass that on. It was not his first advice. My father's first advice to me was stay on the payroll. Indeed, he grew out of the Depression, you see. And I always did. I always did. But he said, when you're in law school, he was a lawyer, and he said, when you're in law school, here's what you do. It's a simple thing. After you finish your class, quickly look over your notes. And at the end of the week, you look over your notes from the week. That's all. And then when it comes time for the exam, you'll be surprised at how much you remember. Because the whole secret to this place, and don't tell anyone I said this, see, the rumor they spread around is that they're really teaching you how to think. Ha ha. They claim, they claim, you see, that this really isn't like med school. You know, in med school, you have to go there and memorize 4,000 bones or something. You know, well, they really do the same thing with cases, or cases, or subjects, or you know what happens, what is the statute of limitations over here, or whatever this stuff is, and you have to learn a lot of stuff, and they figured out a way of teaching it so you think, oh, this isn't really about this stuff; it's really about how to think. Well, if you didn't know how to think, you wouldn't be here. I hate to tell you that, forget it. But I think there is a lot to learn, and you will learn it much more easily if, in fact, you review this. That's what we tried to do. We tried to do it. But those you have a beautiful room here and everything. In my day, we just lived under manhole covers, you know. And you have a nice library. We used to go down to Widener, and we would sort of read our stuff in Widener. And the thing about studying in Widener was anyone walked into the reading room, there was a breeze, because everybody's head turned like that. All right, anyway, forget it. It was interesting the first year, and I guess you'll survive it, and it is a lot of work, and you will learn a lot, and you'll listen to what not just the professor, but what your fellow students say, and you'll learn a lot from them, interestingly enough. And so it does require thinking, and you don't have to know bones, at least that's it.
Now, you mentioned a lot of teachers. Did you have a favorite, and what were the qualities that you liked and admired in a great professor? And when you became a law teacher, how did you figure out how to teach?
I didn't. I've never figured it out. Dawson was probably the one who stands out the most, because he wasn't totally 100% involved in law. He'd run for senator, I think, sometime, and he was interested in legal history, and he would go into it deeply. Because law, you think, is sort of 1,000 miles wide and an inch deep, but it isn't really. I mean, I think, and Michael Boudin is a good friend of mine who was a judge for many years on the First Circuit, the same thing. You'll take the things that are the most obvious, the most hornbook, the most absolutely fixed, and you really begin to think about them, and you think, I'm not sure. Don't say that on your exam. But, I'm not sure. And there's a kind of depth to it. And what I tell what I tell the high school students, some of them will be lawyers, I say it's a very, very good profession. Why? I say because in my mind, I do believe this very much. It requires a heart and a head. And it's good to have something that requires a heart, but everybody has a heart. And so you can contribute something there with what you get in your head and your common sense and your ability then to help this person or help this group or help somebody else with what you're able to put together here and understand their problem and understand what's going on over here. And it's a very, very interesting and very worthwhile profession if you put into it what you can put into it.
So speaking of which, you've had a very interesting career. So your last job was very good, right? And
it was that's what Hari Blackman told me. I succeeded. I was his successor. The first day we came in, he was in the office, and he said, "You'll find this an unusual assignment."
Right, so good job, right? And then you've had a bunch of interesting jobs. You had jobs in the executive branch, in the judicial branch, in the legislative branch. You were a law professor. How did you figure out what you wanted to do for a living after you graduated from law school?
Because none of them have really paid me for a living. I mean, that isn't quite true. I just made that up. But how did I figure it out?
Yeah.
That's what. Well, you've chosen to be lawyers. That's my sort of. When I talk to a group that's graduating from college, I know they're nervous. Or if they're in high school, they're nervous, where are they going to get into college? And I'd say the best advice, personal advice in this kind of thing, was given to me by Bayless Manning, who was the dean at Stanford. And when I finished...
No relation to me, by the way.
I finished my clerkship, and and he said, you know, and I had to make some choices. And he said, you, and I want the college graduates to know this, you are never, when you make very important choices for yourself, going to know, he said, more than about 5% of what you'd like to know in order to make an intelligent choice. And so, I mean, don't become a tightrope walker, you know, unless you are very unusual. But within the range there, you don't know. So lighten up. And you can use what you know. There's no right answer to that question either. What you do is you choose. And then once you choose, your life unfolds around you. And there'll be some good things, and there'll be some not so good. And there we are. And you sort of develop your life as you go along. And that's just what it is. That's my experience. And that's what Manning really said would happen, and it does. It's what happens. And I tell my children that. And if you think you can get your children to believe you about something, forget it. I mean, but there we are. There we are. And so it happens. And you make choices as you go along.
And so no formula, no 5-year plan, that nothing guided you in, I'm going to do this next.
I wanted to teach. I thought I wanted to teach.
Okay.
And I wasn't positive. I'd been teaching for 5 years at least before I decided, well, I guess I'm not going to go out and practice law in San Francisco with whatever the firm was. That's my, I don't know. There we are. And that's my father's second advice. And I tell that to the students too, the graduates. He said, you know, the only thing you can advise people if they want, they're pretty ambitious. You're probably, most of you, pretty ambitious. So you say, the answer, if you're, do your best. Do a good job. Listen to what other people say. You don't have to follow it. But pay attention to where they're coming from. And get them to talk. And talk about things. And do your job as well as you can. He says, you do your job as well as you can. Just whatever that job is, do it. I was thinking my wife is English. And that's what I said last night. She was unhappy about, you know, obviously. And so I said, well, this queen, what she did, you know, she did her job. And that's true. And that's what people, and look, she did her job. And that's what he said, do your job. And do it as well as you can. And then, you know, maybe somebody will notice, and you'll get a better job, or one you like better. And maybe they won't. But at least you've done it well. And that will be a plus.
So you seem to have taken that advice to heart, right? And you've done pretty well for yourself. And then here's the question from that, which is, what along your career, you've probably had some disappointments. So what do you think about the disappointments and the way they've shaped you, and how did you deal with them when they happened?
Well, I haven't had too many disappointments. I mean, you know, I'm not going to be an opera singer, you know. I'd love to have been one, but I can't sing. All right, so your disappointment, you go on to the next thing. You go on to the next thing. I was, say, when I was working in the Senate, I wanted to, hey, Arthur Goldberg told me that. I clerked for Arthur Goldberg when he was on the court. And God, we had some cases, and I worked really hard, and no, we didn't get a majority. We're in dissent. And I'd say, oh my God, they didn't really think this in 1868. I mean, we're right on that. And we lost. And so he'd say, what do you want me to do, cry? He'd say, you go on to the next thing. On to the next thing. And I say that now. I say, I mean, last year was not a great year for me. So, okay. Was I unhappy about the Dobbs, abortion. Yeah, I was. And so what do you do? Fine. Okay, there we are. And sometimes people will decide things, and I'll have this fabulous point, a fabulous point. Unfortunately, nobody accepted it, or there we are, and you go on to the next thing. And does that mean you're heartless? No, I don't think so, but so what? The point is you lose some, you win some, you do your best, and you're on to the next. And the person who really thought that, and the person probably I got on better with at the court than anybody else, was Sandra O'Connor. And Sandra and David Souter and I mean, it's just that we were coming from the same place, and we were good friends. We all get on well. We all got on well. Nino and Clarence Thomas and everybody, and yes, we did, as people. And politics and deciding cases or whatever you find controversial, that's one thing. And human relations are something different. And there we are. And my God, you learn that over time. I mean, you really do. And that's what, I heard this story, and I don't know if it's true, so don't, but I asked some people that when President Biden first came to the Senate, he was on the floor, and Senator Helms was saying something about Senator Kennedy that wasn't very nice. It was sort of borderline, because you're supposed to be polite. And that really annoyed President Biden when he was the senator, and he got up and gave a talk which wasn't too nice about Helms. And he got back to his office, and there was a message called Senator Mansfield, who was the Democratic leader, and he went down there, and Mansfield said, "I don't want to hear you ever give a talk like that again in the Senate." It was too borderline. Yes. He says, "I'll tell you something you may not know. 2 weeks ago, Senator Helms' wife was diagnosed with very serious cancer. One of the first things he did was call Senator Kennedy. And he asked Senator Kennedy to help, and Kennedy found a really good set of, up here in Boston, good set of doctors, and they took her under their wing and got the best treatment he could for her." Okay? He says, politics is one thing, and human relations is another. And my goodness, I won't bore you with the many, many times. And that's just what it is. You want to go through your life, I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
And that's still true today?
Oh, of course. Of course. Is it true? Is the Senate the same as it was then? I don't know. I'm not working on the staff there. I love that job. I love the job of being chief counsel of judiciary. I just really liked it. I used to ride a bicycle at that point, and I'd ride my bicycle into the morning. I could hardly wait to get there. You never knew what was going on. I mean, it was amazing. And you learn something about life in America, too. There was a young woman who was in my office when I came in one afternoon, and she was looking through all my books. And I said, thank you, but where are you? Who are you? And she was a student at a nearby, or something, I don't know, but somebody wasn't supposed to be there, so I was a little annoyed. But you know the first thing that occurred to me? Maybe she's a constituent. And so there we are, in the United States of America. I was nice to her, but all right. Anyway, but the point is, I really did. And Kennedy would say, that's why he was such, you talk to people who work for him. I mean, they love this. Why? Well, it was such fun. I mean, very serious about trying to achieve various things he wanted to, but fun. And a good sense of humor about himself and everything else. And what he told us, which my law clerks at the court have engraved with several other things on a mug that they gave me, is listen to what other people say. And credit, two things on that mug. One, hey, the best is the enemy of the good. You can get 30% out of that group, do it. And the people who normally support you will say you're a traitor and a rat. Forget that. You get the 30% as opposed to being a hero for nothing. You see? And I saw that over and over. And then he would say, when you're dealing with, say, the Republican side, or maybe it wasn't, it could have been on the Democratic side, but people don't agree with you on this particular thing. Fine, get them there, as I said, and get them to talk. And if they talk long enough, you'll find things you agree with. And when you find something you agree with, you say, hey, that's a pretty good point. Let's see if we can work with that. And then you do work with that, and pretty soon, maybe, you'll get something that has that 30 or 40 or even 50%. You see? And now, when you do that, remember, credit is a weapon. Hey, if it works and you get this thing, well, there'll be plenty of credit to go around. And if it doesn't work, who wants the credit? So I saw him so many times. We say it was Senator Hatch or somebody else, and the press comes in and something we actually got, and they're asking him about it, and he says, don't talk to me, talk to Senator Hatch. Orrin was so helpful on this. Okay? And that's something worth, I think, remembering, and I learned that from him and the people who see what we liked it. And learned a lot.
So was that your favorite job before you went on the bench?
Absolutely. I loved it because something was going on every second. Every second. And you never knew, oh, God. You never knew what was going to happen. And you had to try to keep this Judiciary Committee under, if not under control, not under, at least sort of running and so forth. And it was fun.
And which job prepared you best for?
Nothing. For
your job on the
that
Supreme
does
Court?
that right there.
Yeah. And how did it shape your views of the work you did of deciding cases?
Yeah, that. I mean, because you're deciding cases, but I mean, when you're in the conference room after you've heard the case, you've read the briefs, you go in, when you go into the conference room on Friday, the first thing you're going to discuss is probably the cases you heard that week, and you go around the table. The basic rule is no one speaks twice till everybody speaks once. Very good rule. I was a junior for 11 years, you know, and so it helped me, so I am a little biased on that, but nonetheless, that's a good rule. Nobody speaks twice till everybody speaks once. And I did not end up, Story was the junior justice the longest, 11 days more than I was. And Alito was sworn in, and I thought of writing him a letter saying, Dear Sam, could you possibly delay this 11 years so that I could be the longest serving junior justice and go down in history as the answer to a trivia question? You know, I thought, there we are. So you go around the table, and each of us has a book, and each of us writes down the essence of what the others are saying. And then after you've done that, there's some back and forth discussion. And the discussion is not, ha, 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 I have a better argument than you. Forget that. That's only going to lead the person on the opposite side to think he has a better argument than you do. So it just doesn't help. So you listen to where they're coming from. And then when you hear what they're coming from, where and what and why, then sometimes you can make some kind of contribution to that thought, which may help to produce a more unified court or bring people around sometimes to the point of view that you've taken. But that conference, I think, Nino did not think it was important. He thought that everybody had his mind made up by the time he got into the conference room. I don't think that's true. I think, being open-minded, which is one of the things you learn, is not having a point of view. You have a point of view. I look at the blue brief, you know. I look at the first brief, and I read the question. Hey, I know the answer. And then I go and read the brief. Yeah, right, I sure do. And then I read the red brief, the opposite. Oh, not so fast. Not so fast. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you're sort of back and forth. And then talking to the clerks. I love my clerks. I mean, it is like a big family. And we'd talk and we'd discuss everything. But before I go into that oral argument, I've read the briefs. After reading them, I want my clerk, we divide them into 4, and the clerks have written me a memo on things I want to know about and anything else they want to put in. And we've discussed that. And then we're in oral argument. So briefs, one discussion, maybe two discussions. And then in oral argument, the point is for us, the judges, to ask questions. If you, the lawyer, have a great point that you want to be sure you have heard, hey, why didn't you put it in the brief? Because every one of us thinks that we know the case fairly well. Now, that isn't always true, but we think it. And then it's for us really to ask questions of the lawyers. And it works fairly well. So they have an hour, sometimes a little more, to half an hour each side, sometimes a little more, to discuss the main issue. So you're up there. What Archie Cox used to say when he was Solicitor General, I didn't have him for a class, but I worked for him. And he was great. Really very, very good. He said the way you win a case in the Supreme Court, there's some truth to this. He said, first, you get them to want to do what you want them to do. And second, you tell them how. That second part's important. So it's why they want to do it and how they can do it. And go read. You want to read an interesting set of briefs? Read Thurgood Marshall's oral argument in the Supreme Court in Brown, which I read. I'd never read it. I read it about 3 or 4 years ago. And my opinion of that argument is he's telling the court not very much that racial segregation is unconstitutional. Why doesn't he talk a lot about that? He doesn't need to. They know it. What he's trying to convince them is that if they do it, in my opinion, if they do it, they will be able to bring the country along. And that's what they're not sure about. And, and of course it was touch and go, my God. And there's an opinion by Holmes, which I forget the name of it, but it was before, and it was on discrimination in voting. And he puts in there, they had some technical reason for dismissing it and so forth. And he said, this technical reason, he says, well, maybe, but he said, the real thing is here, we know that if we say you cannot discriminate in voting, which is after all what the 15th Amendment does say, he says, if we tell them that, nobody's going to pay any attention to us. They won't do it. And that's why it's probably a political question. We can't get it done. That was many years before World War II. That was many years before Brown. But he's thinking that. And Marshall knows that. And Marshall knows that what he's got to do is just what he did. You can get this done. It isn't easy, but you can do it. And you read some of the conference reports, the report when the people write their notes and so forth. Pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting. That's what Jackson was worried about. Jackson was worried about whether they could get it done. And I think, probably no more. Anyway, I'm going on. So.
No, it's very interesting. So you said that you often read the blue brief and you think you know.
Yeah, I know this, but then I go to the other one and I'm back and forth, and then gradually, it's like a businessman probably, or anybody in any profession. You think, oh, it begins to go over here. And then once, you say, well, maybe this is and then you're in oral argument. In oral argument, you still can switch. But I say, how often do you switch in oral argument?
That's exactly what I was going to ask you, actually. How often do you switch in oral argument? And
my grandfather used to take me to Chandu the magician at the Orpheum Theater, where he would read minds.
Yeah. So when you change, how often do you change your mind?
In oral argument, I would say 10%.
And where else? How about a conference?
Wait, because because change
Sorry, Your
your
Honor.
mind. No. No, it's what's changing your mind. For A to not A, rare. 10%, 15. But how you look at the case. That can be much more often. this is more important than that, and that's pretty important over here, and that's not quite the way I saw it, because how you look at the case is going to affect the words that appear in that opinion. And that is very high on the list of what will guide people as they try to follow the law and advise their clients. So it matters. That oral argument, in my opinion, matters. And yeah. And then in the conference, the next day is the conference, or 2 days later, 3 days on a Friday. And in the conference, it's the same thing. Because on Thursday, you're sitting there having heard the arguments Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Now you got to make up your mind. I sit there with my clerks, and you really have to make up your mind. Where are you going here? What is this? And some are easy, and some are not. Most are not. And most are a lot harder than you perhaps think. And there's a lot to be said on both sides of, I mean, after all, good judges have come to different conclusions on the same question of federal law. And if that were not so, we probably wouldn't have taken the case. I'm not saying that applies to every case, but I will say it used to be 5-4s, well, 18, 15%, 20%, 40% unanimous. You see, so, but in any case, you have to have made up your mind on that Thursday pretty much. And I will have, and I'll go into conference with a fairly good idea. But then again, I didn't think of that one. You change from A to not A? Pretty rare. But not as rare as Nino thought.
How about when after an opinion circulates?
Very rare yet, but maybe once every year or 2 years.
You'll see you'll switch your vote after.
The vote will switch, but not too often. The words, much more often, and more often than when you were the clerk. When you were there, I mean, last year it's extraordinary. I think it's far too much. I mean, people write, they get drafts, you know. The Chief Justice assigns the opinions, but he's much more limited in his power than you might think, because everybody writes one, and then everybody has to write two, and then everybody three, and so he has to make sure that works out, and then he has to make sure we're going to get at least 5 people on an opinion. And there's some that are sort of difficult to do that. I discovered how to get an opinion assigned to me pretty soon. Second year or third year, I'm last, remember? And if it's 4-4, you know how I can guarantee that I will get the opinion? I just say, I'm not sure. And I didn't like that one a little bit. I learned that pretty fast, but there we are. And so then you're writing an opinion. I have my law clerk go and do a draft or a memo or something, and I get a long thing, and I sit down at the word processor, and I write my opinion. And I give it back to her, and she thinks hers was much better, but nonetheless, there we are. And we go back and forth, and eventually get something we'll circulate. And then I don't care if people write me memos and say, oh, what a wonderful opinion. Believe me, that's not the job to say I join. Just 2 words. And now a lot of memos come more than used to. Come around and say, well, I will join to do this, make this change, make the other change. Okay, so that's what we do it. I can try myself. And John Stevens was very good at that. Get the answers out quickly, join or don't join, okay, if you possibly can. And that, of course, is something that there is no treatise on. When the other person writes the opinion and you read it, you're not going to agree with every single thing. Well, how far? How far do you go in disagreement before you say, I'm going to write a concurrence? Before you say, I'm going to write a dissent? Be careful. People are really interested in what the court thinks, not what I think or Sandra thinks or somebody else thinks about what the Constitution means. Everything conspires against your believing that until you understand what people think of the court and how it works. I learned that pretty quickly. In 3 years, I'm in some kind of a reception for young lawyers, and one comes up and says, "Oh, Justice Breyer, I really think your opinions are just great. I read them all. I love them." And he says, "Would you mind signing your autographs?" "Oh, fine." So as he goes off, he turns to his friend and he says, "Well," he says, "that makes 4. Okay, get it? Yeah, right. And how far do Holmes says can't helps. And if you read, which is very interesting, Robert Post is writing the Supreme Court devise, the Holmes devise, on the Taft board. And a lot of opinions, Holmes and Brandeis were on there, McReynolds was there too. A lot of them really disagreed with the opinion, but they went along with it. And should you do that, and to what extent? People do it less now. And I think that's unfortunate, because people are interested in I say that a lot, but it's true. You wear these robes black because the law is speaking through you. And nobody believes that. But it's there. And okay.
So I'm just going to preface this question with a little observation. So I once argued, you won't remember this, I once argued a case before you. You voted against me. But it's okay, so did the other 8. And my question is this: what makes for a good oral argument? I really want to know.
Well, you'll have 1 or 2 points that you think are just great, so make those in not more than 3 minutes. And then I think 2 things. 1, you want to be sure that you address what is the toughest and best argument on the other side. And the second is simply listen to the question and answer the question. There we are. That's what Mike Berman told me in the confirmation process. He said, what you tell a witness? Listen to the question. The senators will ask you a question. They can't make you answer immediately. Think about it for a minute. Think about it. And then answer it. And answer it completely. And your object is not to show how clever you are. Your object is to get confirmed. So answer the question. And when they get their answer, they'll go on to the next question. And then the one after that, and then somebody else will, and finally they'll get finished all their questions, and then you will be confirmed. Didn't seem to me to be quite that easy, but nonetheless.
It all worked out.
That was a long time ago, too. And it's gotten tougher. But anyway, I think that's the same there. You listen to what the judges, try to figure out where they're coming from, and try to answer the question.
How important is it to be upfront about the weaknesses in your case?
Absolutely, in my opinion. But remember, I have a self-interest. I'm a judge. I want to know what the weaknesses are. But I think you're better off finding the weakest thing in your case, the strongest thing on the other side, and saying, this is what I think is the answer to that.
All right, so this is a little bit of an abstract question. Why do you write dissents? I don't mean you in particular. Why do justices write dissents? So I'm talking to a lot of the 1L sections, and I told them I used to ignore dissents when I was 1L. It was a very bad idea. You should pay attention to the dissents. And so who's your audience when you're writing a dissent?
The others in the court.
Are you trying to persuade them in that case?
I'm not going to persuade them to shift, but I might persuade them to... They always do, almost always. No one likes to be thought of as an idiot by anybody. So you have a good point in that dissent, and they'll answer it. And if they don't exactly answer it, they'll modify. And so you have a fairly good chance of getting things modified. And then you write, I think that's the major reason. So every dissent you see is failed because it was inevitable. But still, what you don't see there is, hey, there's a concurrence in that case. And the concurrence in that case has 4 lines in it which you think are really helpful. Or there is a footnote in the majority which you think makes a lot of difference. And that's common. That's common. And so you're trying to get that. And then you just can't help it. My God, I can't believe this. Are they really? I don't say that ever, except think it. And there we are. And so don't complain, but just if you want to, you can write a dissent. And I think there are too many dissents. I really do. But that's then you think, well, you're playing to a big audience. Beware of that one. Beware of it. And that's why I say, you'll get the New York Times says, oh, Justice Breyer wrote such a brave dissent. I just think, hey, if it was so brave, why didn't I write the opposite? I mean, they'd criticize it. Please. And don't play for that. It's a human quality that's hard to resist. But resist it if you possibly can. And just do your best. But there might be an element of that. And you say, I want the arguments out here because someday. Well, what day? I mean, maybe. Maybe. Plessy, Justice Harlan won. All right. Maybe. There we are. And so, immediate audience, get it off your chest if you have to. Make these changes and some of it, and then maybe out there. Maybe out there. And, or you have a reason. I mean, to be honest with you, I probably wrote a very long dissent in the gun case that we just had. And I wrote a long dissent because I thought, look, I'm going to write a dissent, and it's about guns, sort of. But it's really about a method of using history to interpret the Constitution. And I want that out there for the next case. And I want that out there because within the judiciary or maybe beyond the judiciary, people might read this and it might help say, be careful of this other approach. And so there are a variety of reasons.
Okay, I have two final questions, and then we're going to open it up for the audience. So the first one is one I'm very, very interested in knowing your answer to, which has been true of all these. So there's a professor at BU you know of who every year looks at the transcripts of your court and counts the number of times it says laugh and proclaims who the funniest justice is, right? And so for the last 5 or 6 years, you've been the funniest justice.
After Nino.
So prior to that was Justice Scalia was consistently, and you were right behind him. Okay, so now my question is, you've retired from the Supreme Court. During October term 2022, who will be the funniest justice?
You know what I really think when I read that?
What?
Who is it?
His name is Jay Wexler.
I don't know. And I've never till this second known his name. I have never known his name, whoever writes that. And my reaction, honestly, is, doesn't he have something better to do? And then that really is my honest reaction. And if people bring it up, I usually say it's like, being the warmest Eskimo igloo or something, or being the funniest justice on the Supreme Court, being the tallest short person. I mean, please. This is ridiculous. But anyway, there we are. And I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. No. Fair enough.
And my oral argument is a nightmare often because I don't prepare for it. I do ask what I think is on my mind at the time. So I've said all kinds of things, and that's why I perhaps got this title, that just get me into a lot of trouble.
Okay.
And one of them, I'll tell you what, at least one came into my head. The worst thing was, I remembered from law school, and Lon Fuller and Al Sachs, what they do in order to show that context matters and so forth, that any doesn't really mean any. What happens if you had a sign in the park and it said no vehicles in the park? And does that apply to a Jeep used as a monument to the Marines or on a pedestal? All right, that was his thing. So something came up sort of where that was relevant, and I decided to say that, but I couldn't remember it. Okay. So I start off by saying, suppose you're in the park and there's a sign saying no animals in the park. He said, oh. And at that point, I'm totally stuck. I had the wrong example. I didn't know what to say. So what I did say was I said, well, does that apply if you have, for example, a pet oyster? So Rehnquist, who never does this, leaned over and said, did you have a pet oyster? There we are. God.
All right. There's not a graceful segue from that. My last question is this. So you have a lot of people new to Harvard Law School, and what advice do you have for them as they think about this coming year?
Well, you will work fairly hard, but don't lighten up.
All right.
That doesn't mean don't work. It means you've got to read those notes, listen to what other people say, review them, and there we are. You'll do the best you can. It's not a problem. And whether you're first in the class or you're 948,000th, I don't know. You'll have a life that's pretty interesting, in all likelihood. Some good things, some bad things. And there we are. So, and you can't do too much about it. Your rank in the class, good, let whoever is first, which I was not. And let them have that, fine. I said, okay, that's a plus for that person. Good. Don't worry about it. Just do your best.
All right, excellent. This seems like a good moment to see if there are questions from the audience. So we have people from the Dean of Students' office who will come around if you raise your hand and just move to the... So we've got some hands, and I will let people with microphones find you. So people with microphones are now fanning out through the crowd. Bless you.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Justice Breyer. My name is Justin Edwards. I wanted to ask, in a time where there's so much concern about people they're losing faith in the court and in democracy as a whole, what are your thoughts on increasing transparency at the Supreme Court, maybe allowing cameras or recordings or just allowing more of what goes on during argument to be seen by the people? Thank you.
I've sort of become more rigid on that. I mean, what they're talking about is having cameras for oral argument. All right, so there's a certain amount of plus to that. But what you don't want, there's also some minus, and I want you to, the minus which is worrying is you don't want people playing to the camera. And that's true of the judges, it's true of the lawyers. The lawyers, if they're the Attorney General of State X, already will go out to the steps and immediately the television camera will be there and they'll talk to the camera. Okay? Don't worry about that. I don't know. I don't know what would happen, but an experiment in that direction, you can't go back. So I think there will be cameras in the courtroom, if you're talking about the oral argument. There should not be, absolutely, in my opinion, cameras when you're negotiating. In Mexico, they try that. But when you're talking in oral argument, it's one thing, but conference, no. You want people to say what they think. And you do not want them playing to any gallery. And you don't want them to thinking, what will history say or so, oh, please. No, you want them to say what you think. And don't worry about looking like an idiot. I've said enough things that make me look like an idiot, and it isn't the end of the world. You say what you think, okay? And so I'd say conference, no. Harder question, oral argument. And so what will happen? There will be cameras. Why do I say that? Because your generation, the others, they don't even know what it was like to live without cameras. I do. I used to come home from school when I was in the 4th grade and listen to the radio. See, that way I know about Tom Mix and the Green Hornet and everybody, but you missed that. Okay, there we are. So you know about cameras, and you will say, well, aren't they there? And they'll be there. And I can be the last one, the last generation to worry about it. And some people who work in the press, and you know their names, have said to me, don't bring in the cameras. You wait till the first time that you see yourself. You say, which is true, as you can tell, I will not worry about the press gallery over there. They're pretty good. The professionals who are in there in the press are pretty good, actually. And it's a big difference. You can tell at once whether newspaper X or television station X has a regular person who's a court reporter or doesn't, because the distance between what's happening and what they report is much greater if they have no regular reporter. But I don't worry. I mean, very rarely. Very rarely. Well, there they say, some of them, wait till you see. You think. Nino used to say, you know what he used to say? He used to say that the press has two pictures of you, one where you look like Torquemada and the other where you look like the Archangel Gabriel. And he said if they agree with you, they run the second, and when they disagree, they run the first. Okay? You think you won't play to the gallery of the Lord. Wait and see. Wait and see the first time that you watch yourself on television while you're in oral argument. And what they've done is say the opposite, have you say the opposite of what you said. Not that they changed the words, but they just use the facial expressions and the context and so forth to give the opposite impression. Yeah, you'll then watch more carefully what you say. And since I'm a person who doesn't watch what he says, for better or for worse, or at least not much, I'd worry about it. And so I thought it wouldn't be there while I'm there. Now, David Souter said it wouldn't be there while he was alive. But there are negatives. And it'll be a time, sometime. But eventually you'll have it. And would that help with the country? Yeah, I doubt it. I don't think so. I think what will help with the country is taking the advice that you give to a judge or to somebody when you want to persuade a group. Listen to the other side. Listen to what they say. And don't just listen to it so you can make a better argument. Where are they coming from? What's their point? And you try to engage in that. And that's what I told us, I told the undergraduates. I say, hey, luckily, there are problems. Of course, the Senate doesn't run the way it did, and there are loads of problems which I needn't go into. You know them just as well as I do. And so try listening. And I want those undergraduates to do. I said, first thing is, you're not going to go sit home and be cynical. Hey, I can't tell you what to do with your life. I say, I hope you fall in love and find someone to love. And I hope that you have a job that you like. And I can't say how you're going to do that. But above all, I hope that you participate in public life. You participate in a million ways. Be in the school board. Go and be on the library commission. See, and then this is dramatic. I say, 'cause you can do it and vote. And get out there and, participate. See, then I pull out this document, which I always have in all my pockets, and that, they all faint. Because, but nonetheless, you see, this is true. I say, I can tell you this after 40 years of experience, that this document won't work unless you do that. And I believe that firmly, and I've seen enough of it in the Senate and on the court, and so people, the country, Kennedy used to say that. He said, the country goes like this, It goes like that, and it'll come around. And there we are. And you participate, you listen, try to persuade, but you do it with some tact and human decency. And all those things. That's why I say sometimes, not always, what you try to get on the court, if you want to improve your character, do that. Good character. That helps.
I think we have time for one more question, after which there'll be a reception on the Belinda Sutton Quadrangle, so please join us out there for that. And so we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I've heard a lot recently about a crisis in confidence with the Supreme Court in our country, and I'm wondering how you think the court can overcome that crisis of confidence, and if you think they deserve the confidence of the American people at this moment, or if they require change to reinstate that.
There isn't too much new in what they're writing about. See, I tend to think, go back to the Taft Court, which I've been reading about. I said, well, they were the ones with Lochner, you know. I mean, they were the ones that property, contract. All right, I said, why did they? Why did they think that? And personally, I think, because I read it, Alan Greenspan wrote a pretty good book on the history of capitalism in the United States. Used to be a poor country, very poor before the Civil War. And then after the Civil War until 1920, power, electric power, automobiles, new ways of investing, new ways of getting these developments around, and people got rich, everybody. Very few didn't, very few didn't. And Taft is sitting there thinking the progressives are going to destroy the goose that's laying the golden egg. Okay, so he then thinks these words contract, property, and then writes some opinions that by the time the Depression comes in the New Deal court, nobody believes what Taft was writing. I mean, you see? So we have some other things, and then we have some other things, and we have some other things. And you don't live there thinking whether the people are going to approve you or not. Now, when I say that, you have to take me with a grain of salt, but not a barrel of salt. You see? And because, yes, it is an institution that is part of the governing institutions of the United States. And on balance, do I think it has been good for the country? Yes, but I'm self-interested. And sometimes I can get myself thinking, geez, maybe it'd be better if we were without it. I mean, they did write Dred Scott, you know, and they did write a few decisions that are not necessarily the world's greatest. And but still, when you see people, as I'm sitting in the bench, see that? You see people of every race, every religion, every point of view. And my mother used to say that. We lived in San Francisco. I won't insult Los Angeles, but she used to say that there's no point of view so crazy. There isn't someone in this country who doesn't hold it. And then she'd say they all live in Los Angeles, but don't tell her. but nonetheless, this is a very, very big country. No more 4 million people, 331 million people. And my God, there's everything under the sun. And yet they take this document, they may not know what's in it, but you see them there. And of course, when I talk with students at Stanford and I tell them these exact same words, you know, and I say, there they are, and they think they've decided to solve a lot of problems under law, which means you won't get them right. Sometimes you will, and sometimes you won't. But before we were talking about Bush v. Gore, see, and so I say, Harry Reid, who was the Democratic leader, I heard him say in the court, he said, you know, the most remarkable thing about that case is never remarked, and that is even though, one, it's very important, it was an important case, he thought, and two, a lot of people, at least, you know, half the country thought it was wrongly decided, and I say maybe a few more than half, but nonetheless, okay. So they followed it. That's what he said. And I say, the Stanford students, I know at least 20% of you, and maybe more than that, think it's too bad there weren't a few riots. Too bad there weren't a few stones thrown. See? So I say, before you conclude that, go turn on your television set. They used to have television sets before they had streaming. And he says, turn on your television set and look at what happens in countries that resolve their major differences that way. Okay? And that's called the rule of law, not to do it that way. That's what it's about. I told that to the woman who was she's president of the Supreme Court of Ghana. And she was in my office there, and she wanted to know, why do people do what you say? Good question. And a long history. A long long history with lots of ups and downs. Okay? But I say, in my view, I go through some of that in condensed form. But I said, he said, fine, tell the people in the newspapers in Accra or whatever, tell them what you do. But the judges can't get people to do this, you know, because they're so self-interested. And the lawyers, too. You've got to convince people who aren't lawyers, because contrary to popular belief, I don't want to disillusion you, but 330 million of our 331 million people are not lawyers. Okay? And I say those are the people. Those are the people that you have to convince that it's worth sometimes following laws that you don't like and the decisions that you think are wrong. And if it's 5-4, somebody's wrong. And that's hard to do and takes a lot of time. So you say, why do it? Well, I can't resist this. Can I end with this then?
Sure.
All right. But I mean, I quote all the time, and I really recommend it if you're going to read something this year that isn't law. Read Camus' book called La Peste, the Plague. Great French writer. And he writes about a plague in Oran, in Algeria. But he's probably really writing about the Nazi occupation of France. And he tells the whole big story of plague, quarantine. And at the end of this book, he says in the last 2 pages, why did I write this book? He said, well, I wanted people to know how people behave during this period, some good, some bad, some wrong. He said, but more than that, I wanted people to know what doctors do, because doctors are people who help others without philosophizing, without thinking about why. They just do it. But more important than that, and he said, the germ, the plague germ, the Bacillus de la Peste, it never dies. It never dies. It goes into remission. It goes into remission and it lurks in the file cabinets and the attics and one day to reemerge. And once again, for the education and the misfortune of mankind, sends its rats into a once happy city. Well, I say, I think he's talking about that bad part of every person. That Bacillus de la Peste it's everywhere. No one is immune. Nobody. And the rule of law, from my experience, is one weapon, not the only weapon by any means, but it is one weapon and one important weapon that we have to try to fight. And there we are. And after 40 years or more, I believe it. And there is no guarantee. End of long, emotional speech.
Thank you, Justice Breyer.